Hello and welcome to Tuesday Talks at Merryspring Nature Center for 2026. My name is John Fromer, the Program Director and your host. Today's Tuesday Talk is generously sponsored by Camden River House. Recordings are made possible by the Cascade Foundation. You can find today's talk and previous talks on our YouTube channel. Merryspring is open every day of the year from dawn to dusk free of charge. Find out more at merryspring.org. This program on mammal hibernation was presented by Eric Brown on February 24th.
So I guess I'll just give a brief background on me. I began my graduate work in Colorado/New Mexico, working with boreal toads. And I was largely interested in the landscape ecology of their immune diversity. As many folks might be familiar, there's a particular fungus called chytrid that has been threatening amphibian populations all over the world, and the same is true in the US and in the Southwest. This toad is extinct in New Mexico, was going extinct in Colorado, or still is, unfortunately, and we were particularly interested in how the immune response of some populations in other parts of the range differ from those in Colorado and why there's that difference between immune response to this fungus. And then I kind of took a short stint to help a friend with her PhD dissertation looking at population dynamics of caiman or alligators in the Pantanal in south central Brazil. And here's me in her small car holding an alligator safely so that it cannot hurt itself or me. And here's some more cute alligators. And presently I work with mammals. So this here's a picture of me holding a pen-tailed tree shrew, which, is not a squirrel, but is actually in a group most closely related to primates. I don't have any close-up pictures here, unfortunately, but they are very human-like. Their ears look very much like our own, and their wrist joints also kind of perform like ours. So these guys don't really hop around like squirrels. They hop around like monkeys, which is really fun. But I spend, like John said, most of my time in Malaysian Borneo, running around the jungle, chasing squirrels, sweating a lot. So it's, I know everyone just got through the winter storm yesterday, but I still appreciate how cool the temperature is compared to the jungle. And for those that joined my talk last year, you might be familiar with a couple of these slides, but I just wanted to orient folks to the questions that I'm interested in and those that are important when we think about the environment. And when we're thinking about thermal ecology or the thermal environment, there are a number of different ways that heat interacts with organisms. And this is a pretty busy figure, but things to just take away are that, we can get heat directly from the sun in the form of radiation, and that radiation can come to us directly from the sun, or it can bounce off of other objects in the environment and eventually reach us. We ourselves also emit a certain degree of radiation. We can convey heat via conduction or when you touch another surface. So your feet or whatever surface you might be touching, whether it's another person or a table or something like that, there's some degree of heat that is conveyed between those surfaces. And then there's also convection, which we probably are most familiar with in the form of wind. And that is important for interplaying with evaporation and wet surfaces on organisms. And also familiar, if you were at my talk last time, is this spectrum. For mammals, which are endotherms, or organisms that can produce their own body heat, there's a spectrum of versions of that endothermy, or ability to produce and maintain your body heat. And on probably the more familiar end to us, there's a strict control of body temperature and metabolic rate, which we would call homeothermy, and humans are definitely in that category, and I think historically have provided a biased lens for us to categorize all other endotherms, for better or for worse. And then beyond homeothermy, we get into this category called heterothermy, which is a giant grouping of different forms of heterothermy or endothermy that have some varied degree of flexibility in the control of body temperature and metabolic rate. And so this category next to homeothermy we call thermalability, or just flexibility in body temperature that does not involve active suppression and metabolism. So technically speaking, I would say all organisms, all endotherms are thermolabile to a certain degree. Even humans have some measured flexibility in body temperature, especially on a daily scale. So at night while you're asleep, your body temperature is at its lowest, albeit not that much lower than when you're active during the day, but there is some degree of patterning to your body temperature through the day. And for other organisms, that degree of variation is a bit more pronounced. And in a lot of cases, it can convey some degree of energy savings. Next to that, we have short torpor, which is some degree of active metabolic suppression, usually less than a day. The time period is rather short, as the name would imply. And then beyond that, we have long torpor, which is the same as short torpor, just active suppression of metabolic rate, with usually some decrease in body temperature over a period of usually a couple days. And then beyond that, you have typically more severe suppression of metabolic rate, usually deeper decrease in body temperature for a much longer period of time, usually periods of months, that we call hibernation. And I want to highlight here that while these are categories that we've used historically to put animals into boxes, they aren't really mutually exclusive. So an individual or a population or a species might be capable of multiple of these different kinds of endothermy in their life, depending on season, life stage, and that sort of thing. And so this figure kind of conveys like what is the difference between those different groups in the kind of energy savings they provide. And so just to orient everyone here, let me see if I can. So let's look at the bottom portion of this figure here, the metabolic rate versus ambient temperature. This TNZ zone is known as the thermoneutral zone, and it is basically just a range of ambient temperatures that across which metabolic rate for an organism is about the same. So at this lower bound, this vertical black dotted line that goes up to LCT, or lower critical temperature, this is the ambient temperature at which your body temperature and your metabolic rate is as low as it needs to be to maintain a certain body temperature. And below that point, you have to fight to maintain your body temperature at a desired level. And the black here we would call normothermy. So if an individual wanted to remain routinely active during, say, winter, where ambient temperatures are below this lower critical temperature, then you need to produce a lot of body heat. And that of course, has an energy cost associated with it. Now, this blue line here kind of symbolizes thermal ability. What if you just let your body temperature decrease a little bit when it is colder outside, and you just wanted to maintain your body temperature just a few degrees lower? That would convey a certain degree of energy savings versus burning hot for, well, just to burn hot. And then these other two, orange signifying shallow torpor, and red, get out of the way so you can read that, for deep torpor or hibernation, kind of signify that, metabolic rate is actively being suppressed, so body temperature can be much lower. And over the course of, a period of time where ambient temperatures are lower than this lower critical temperature, you can have a much more pronounced degree of savings in energy over that period of time. And these are important considerations to make. I guess I can't get out of the way that this beautiful picture. Important considerations to make in a place that has temperate seasons. So a place like New England, where we've got 4 distinct seasons that vary in precipitation, whether that's amount of precipitation or kind of precipitation, variation in temperature. I think we're probably all very well familiar with how temperature varies across seasons here, and resource availability. So in a lot of ways, these play together, usually to the detriment of the animals that choose to stay here through winter. But they're very important considerations for whether or not evolutionarily a species or a group of species, quote unquote, decides to maintain certain energy consumption levels or decides, quote unquote, to allow their body temperature metabolism to appropriately react to whether or not they can actually get the resources they need to maintain a certain level of energy consumption. And so something to keep in mind as well is that the type of endothermy that species show or can show have over the past 50, 60, 70 years been shown to correlate with a few different things. And a big one is body size. Usually, because body size incorporates this factor of, the bigger you are, the lower surface area you have versus the volume you have. So very small animals like shrews, for instance, have a much greater surface area than they do a volume, which means that they are more susceptible to heat loss than something like a moose, which has a much greater volume than surface area, and it is much more able to conserve its body heat in that way. It's very important to, of course, they're not considering these things because they're not deciding one way or the other, but it plays into whether or not we see certain species exhibiting certain forms of endothermy. Also important is diet. So for some diets, there is just no feasible way to get your preferred source of nutrients through a season like winter, whether that's, fresh greens or seeds or insects or what have you. It plays a very important role in whether or not you can maintain your metabolic rate and body temperature through winter. The kind of diet it is, not even just if it's available, but how calorie dense is it? So for carnivores, typically, that's a very energy dense kind of food. So carnivore strategies tend to be different than herbivores, and also evolutionary lineage and like what your ancestors were able to do has a very big contribution to whether or not you could do it too, hypothetically, and whether or not your relatives can also do it. And that these are the kinds of considerations we make, especially when we're thinking about species that we don't yet know about, is, who would we expect to be able to do what and where? And so in New England, and John was just telling me about a mammals program that he had put together. I'm blocking this beautiful little silhouette, but we have one species of marsupial, the opossum. I'm sure y'all down in Camden see them more often than us up here, but my lab recently put together something like an opossum response team, just because we're interested in tracking the northward expansion of opossum in Maine, because historically, even up to 20, 30 years ago, they weren't here, and it is directly a consequence of climate change. And well, as anyone can say, if they've encountered an opossum in the wintertime, they don't really seem well suited to it, given their naked tails and naked hands. And certainly they are not. They evolved in the tropics in South America and have just been since expanded northward. But oftentimes, opossum will, if they survive winter, emerge to the other side with frostbitten tails and ears. So I would encourage them not to keep coming north, but it just gets warmer and warmer, so it's not enough of a deterrent. We've also got 59 species of placental mammals, so mammals that give live birth to young that are more or less able to fend for themselves, including 11 species of shrews and moles. Here's like a short-tailed shrew. 9 species of bats. I think this is a little brown. 3 species of rabbits and hares, and of course I'm only including endemic species here that are extant, that currently exist in New England. Here's a snowshoe hare. 20 species of rodents, including squirrels and mice and voles, porcupine, beaver, a couple lemming species, and muskrat. And then we've got 14 species of carnivorans. So our canids, felids, mustelids like otters and fisher and mink and marten, raccoon and skunk. And also 2 species of cervids, or moose and deer. And putting this together is kind of sad to not be able to tack on reindeer or sea mink or other species that are no longer here, as well as like wolverine and wolf. The fauna just in the past 100, 200 years has changed pretty significantly. And so these species have to contend with a very specific kind of climate, and a climate that is changing, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But for New England, and caveat here is that this is specifically Boston, but it's generally similar to what we experience up here in Maine. In our region, precipitation doesn't necessarily vary all too much through the year, at least not in amounts, but of course, form of precipitation certainly does change between the seasons. But more importantly, seasonal temperature has great variability between summer and winter, fall and spring. And also in this figure on the right, we can see this like pink bound around this main line here kind of indicates the variability on a daily scale of the temperatures that you can be expected to experience. So kind of see like here in the fall, right here, that temperature variation on a daily scale is a bit less than might be expected in like January or February at the beginning of this graph here, where differences in temperatures can be at least 10 degrees different between night and day. And so in facing this kind of environment, our mammals have a couple options. And by a couple, I mean literally 2. The one is to go somewhere else, just give up and not bother to deal with it at all, which I think some of us probably also opt for, whatever snowbirds may be among us. And the other option is to stay put and just deal with it. And there are a lot of ways to stay put and deal with it. First, there are only a handful of species that choose to go somewhere else. Just a few species of bat that head somewhere south to overwinter, but most stay put. They're here in Maine in some form. And those that are here may choose to make modifications to their insulating layers. So for snowshoe hares, some length of their fur increases in the winter, and the density of their fur of all types increases. And in thermal physiology jargon, we would say that these animals are decreasing their thermal conductance, which is another way to say, how much heat is being conveyed between their bodies and the surrounding environment. And let's see if, yeah, and here is an example of a least weasel between summer and winter coats. Weasels are a very other kind of contradictory lineage that thermal physiologists are still confused about because they're the absolute worst shape possible for an overwintering species. They're already small, and their shape just increases their surface area while minimizing their volume, meaning they lose even more heat to their environment without even trying. And then here, this figure just kind of shows in the snowshoe hares that between winter and autumn, that to reduce that thermal conductance, reduce the amount of heat that they're conveying to the environment, they increase the length of their guard hairs and increase by a pretty significant degree the density of both their guard hairs and their down hairs. And something that we're kind of wrestling with in my lab today is there's historically been a lot of work put into defining how thermal conductance interacts with this end of the thermoneutral zone, or how animals deal with the threat of loss of heat, but very little work has been done to figure out how animals deal with the loss of heat in the presence of heat. So how do animals ensure that they're not overheating when presented with thermal challenges? And that's kind of a lot of what we're trying to take on right now. And I think we can scroll back to the beginning later, but the concept of thermal conductance here is different than conductance, where heat is conveyed between two surfaces. Thermal conductance here is just a general measure accounting for all the modes of heat loss for the purposes of calculation. It's very difficult to piece apart, wind and radiation and conductance. So they've kind of all been smushed together for our ease of use. And beyond modifying insulating layers, there's also the option to modify behavior. And these southern flying squirrels here in winter become more gregarious in winter, especially up here in the northern parts of their range. They also are known to build better nests. And other species such as shrews and moles are active at the subnivean layer, or that layer just beneath the snow that is right above the ground, and will choose to kind of avoid being out in the open, even to forage. And beyond modifications to behavior, There's also probably the more, I guess, I don't know if it's more obvious, but maybe the more conspicuous option, because hibernation is a very cool and attractive topic. But animals can also just decrease how much energy they are using over the periods of winter. And so, uh, while some organisms like hares will maintain a very constant and elevated body temperature through winter, others will just turn off. And so, between all of these, like all organisms, endotherms at least, that do stay put and overwinter in place, all of them will, to a certain degree, modify their insulation to ensure that they're losing the least amount of energy possible, and they will change their behavior to a certain degree, especially just avoiding the coldest parts of the day, if not necessary, if they don't have to. But there's still this question of what kind of endothermy do they show during this period? Do they maintain a high and constant body temperature? Do they allow their body temperature to be a tad flexible? Or do they choose to just turn it off to a certain degree and just wait for better times? And just a quick refresher here that choice makes a very big difference as far as the amount of energy that it takes to survive a winter, which has a lot to do with the size of the individual, what it eats, and who it is and who it knows. And so for those that stay put and maintain homeothermy or some degree of flexibility in body temperature, there are some mechanisms that allow them to do that, and don't be too concerned with this figure because there's a lot going on, but a big component of that ability to maintain high elevated body temperatures, especially for small mammals like shrews, is something called non-shivering thermogenesis. And I know we all are familiar with shivering thermogenesis, which is just shivering, or the ability to, kind of involuntarily activate your muscles to generate heat without necessarily generating some productive motion. But before shivering thermogenesis is activated, you in some organisms get non-shivering thermogenesis. So there's this particular tissue called brown adipose tissue, or BAT, or brown fat, that is typically in mammals located between the shoulder blades, just below the neck. And humans have this too when we're infants, but we kind of lose this as we mature. And the brown adipose tissue is activated to, kind of like muscle tissue. It goes through this cycle of consuming energy, and in the process of consuming energy for some productive work in non-shivering thermogenesis, there's a step in that process that is kind of skipped. So energy is consumed and processed, but instead of being shunted towards productive motion or activation of muscle cells or some other tissue, most of the energy that is consumed is turned directly into heat. And for shrews, this is very important because they have a very high rate of metabolism, and this helps them to maintain heat balance at low temperatures. And so, in addition to non-shivering thermogenesis, you also have increased nesting behavior, which includes not just nesting, but also building better nests. And there are a good number of studies that have shown that individuals that are forced into like winter-like conditions that are pulled from existing winter temperatures versus warm temperatures are better able to create better nests, more insulated nests than those that are kind of challenged with cold directly from like summer, for example. They are also better at food hoarding, or at least like do hoard food, forage beneath the snow and out of the coldest temperatures during their active phases. So we have that. We have decreasing activity at the coldest parts of the day, which is true for most of these overwintering species. And you also have the increased flexibility in body temperature control. And so here, this figure, I hope it's, I guess I am kind of like in the way here. But basically, the top part of this figure is just showing that in the wintertime, this top line with the squares is a gray squirrel that is provided food freely and is able to keep fairly elevated body temperatures. The triangles here of the same figure are those individuals which were not provided supplemental food, and in wintertime, the decision was made, so to speak, to allow the body temperature to go lower in order to compensate the energy that is lost to maintain heat balance in these individuals. And so food is very important in that strategy of whether or not to maintain body temperature at this elevated level. And the bottom portion of this graph is just in summertime, we still see that degree of difference, especially in the morning time, that supplemental food fed individuals were able to maintain higher body temperatures than those that were not presented with supplemental food. And this is also true in other forms. We'll get to that here in a bit. And in moose, there is also temperature flexibility over the course of the year, but not necessarily, well, it might indirectly be because of lack of availability of food. So here we see this top quadrant, body temperature over the course of a year peaks during the summertime, hottest time of the year, and has this severe decrease, these like black and blue sections at the cooler ends of the year. And likewise, activity, this bit just below, this second one, activity also peaks in summertime when, the growing season is at its peak, and decreases at the least productive times of the year in wintertime. And similarly, we can see heart rate, at least the amount that they were able to measure, peaks in summertime and decreases in wintertime, kind of following the trajectory of ambient temperature as well. And this is cheating a little bit just because this is Wolverine and they're no longer present here, but I thought it was too cool not to share. But this figure is showing daily body temperature for several individuals of Wolverine across a year. And the red lines here show body temperature of non-pregnant individuals, and the black lines up top show the body temperature of pregnant Wolverines over the course of the year. And pretty pronouncedly here, we can see that like during pregnancy, Wolverine females are allowing their body temperatures to drop. And of course, it's 1 degree Celsius, so about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, but there is something about pregnancy that compels them to allow their body temperature to drop, probably to conserve energy. Of course, a lot of that is speculation. We still don't necessarily know. There's not too many people who work with Wolverines, but I think this is still a pretty cool finding. And so, there's that option, and then increased nesting behaviors like we talked about for southern flying squirrels. which up here, if you have seen flying squirrels at all, the southern flying squirrels are the smaller of the two, and the northern flying squirrel is the larger of the two, about twice the size of the southern flying squirrel. But these southerns, throughout their range, and they can be found down to Central America, but down south, in Florida through Central America, their nesting behaviors are pretty lazy, pretty relaxed, and often they'll just nest on open branches just outside, often with 1 to 2 individuals. But in Maine and other northern parts of the range, they are very frequently cavity nesters inside tree hollows, and oftentimes with several individuals. And in nesting communally like this, and sleeping together in a ball, they increase their collective mass, which increases their collective volume related to their surface area. So they're less likely to convey heat to their environment than if they were nesting alone. And then the other option is just routinely active, which is very common for carnivores and ruminants especially, like moose and deer, because they can't necessarily stop processing plant matter or else it's game over for them. So they kind of necessarily have to remain active through winter. The same is true for rabbits and hares. And then the option to stay put but actively suppress your metabolic rate has a few options. Short torpor, like we said, metabolic suppression for periods of less than a day, which decreases metabolic rate significantly and is often associated with a drop in body temperature. And then there's long torpor and hibernation, which sees longer term suppression of metabolic rate and usually more severe decreases in body temperature. And this very busy figure is just a representation of the evolutionary relationship between all mammals that, at least at the time of publishing for this paper, all of the mammals that we know to either hibernate or engage in torpor. And so here, I know it's really tiny, but the darkest blue are those species that hibernate. The royal blue, those that can do long torpor, and then the light blue are those that engage in short torpor. And so represented here, we have rodents up at the top, which are a lot, and they're capable of all three of those things. Some primates are able to engage in torpor and hibernation, especially tarsiers are a pretty common study species, as well as lemurs, and then chiropterans, which are bats. A lot of bats engage in torpor and hibernation to endure winters. And then there's a handful of species of bear, some shrews, some what we call afrotherians, so certain species of African mammals that engage in torpor and hibernation, such as the elephant shrew and other weird animals. And then there are some other marsupial groups that are represented. And so when we look at short torpor, the advantage is, here we go. Short torpor, the advantage is pretty apparent. So here we have a figure representing metabolic rate across the period of the active period of white-footed and deer mice. And so this top part of this figure is looking at ambient temperatures of about, that's a little less than 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The middle one is ambient temperatures of just below 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and the bottom part here is looking at ambient temperatures of about freezing, just above freezing. And in all of them, we can see how important nesting is. For those individuals that were able to put together a nest, there are obvious, pretty significant energy consequences to being able to nest or not having a nest. And so between these, like nesting is obviously very important and allows them to save a considerable amount of energy. And between temperatures, we can see like at like this bottom one here or near freezing, and then the next one up just below like 50 degrees Fahrenheit, that metabolic rate is pretty similar between the two. But at higher temperatures, above 50 degrees, we can see in the top one that the even without a nest, I kind of can't get my finger up there, but even without a nest, metabolic rate here is like at 6 compared to the other two where it's closer to about 10. We'll just use 10 as a proxy for 10 energy units for our purposes. But ambient temperature and having nesting material to buffer the ambient temperature makes a huge difference in the amount of energy used, which is very important for very tiny animals like deer mice and white-footed mice. And then there's also long torpor and hibernation. So for black bears, I just want to take a look at this figure, which kind of, I don't know, might seem a bit complicated, but it demonstrates something very, very, very cool, which is why it is published in Science. But at the top part of this figure, we see oxygen consumption, which is another proxy for metabolic rate. And so we can see during, since the beginning of the year, January on to about mid-April, they're in hibernation. Their metabolic rate is pretty low. And then about middle of April, they emerge from hibernation and their metabolic rate kind of like takes a couple weeks to creep up to normal levels. And so through this period, their metabolic rate, or through hibernation, their metabolic rate is about 30% of normal levels. But when we look at their core body temperature in the bottom part of this graph, we see that their body temperature, it's fairly variable through hibernation. That's not necessarily the important part of this graph. It's just that when they emerge from hibernation, their body temperature seems to recover almost immediately. As soon as they emerge from hibernation, their body temperature is about normal. And the implications here are that body temperature and metabolic rate aren't necessarily linked to one another, which seems incredibly counterintuitive. You would think that your ability to increase and maintain your body temperature at a certain level would have to absolutely do with the amount of metabolic heat that you're producing. And so we still don't really understand like how or why it is that they're able to get their body temperatures back to normal while their metabolic rate is like lagging by upwards of 70% of normal rates. And it lays bare a lot of questions that we still have and a lot of things we still don't quite understand about how metabolism is related to body temperature and the importance or lack of importance of body temperatures. So there's still a lot of open questions here. And I wanted to, just for fun, share this video of a black bear. Oh, I think you should be able to hear that. with that. I just wanted to just highlight, how long the breaths are in how long between the breaths in hibernation, which is a direct reflection of how low their metabolic rate is. And it's just a fun video. And then, and bears hibernate in a very specific way. Like and there's still a great debate about whether or not like what bears do is actually hibernation. I think it is. I think it's the most stereotypical, like when people think of hibernation, they think about bears. But there are a lot of hardliners who have a lot of bones to pick about that and are more on the side of what we see in small mammals, such as the eastern chipmunk, which also engage in active metabolic suppression, but because of their such small body size, they can't necessarily store their winter fuel in the form of fat, and so they through the fall period are caching food, and during their winter hibernation will have what we call interbout arousals, and so they'll hibernate for a time, they'll kind of emerge, they'll come to metabolic rate, will come back to normal levels, they'll eat something, and then they re-enter hibernation, and they'll do this several times over winter. And this figure here is from my advisor, Danielle Levesque, her master's program. She worked very closely with eastern chipmunks, and this just shows that, when allowed to be active in both summer and winter, there is a pretty marked difference in body temperature in individuals, as shown by the upper two parts of this graph. And then this bottom graph here is showing winter hibernation. And body temperatures here are very much more suppressed. So if we go back and look at the bears, like their core body temperature is only getting down as low as maybe, like 86, 87 degrees Fahrenheit from a normal level of like 98, 99. But the eastern chipmunks are getting down to as low as like 59, 58 degrees Fahrenheit from a normal of upwards of like 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So their body temperature suppression is much more pronounced than large hibernators like bears. And similar trends is seen too in metabolic suppression. All bears, it's impressive, 30% of their normal metabolic rate. Small mammals, especially small squirrels like the eastern chipmunk, can get much lower, down to 5%, 10% of their normal metabolic rate. And all of these are very important to consider in today's current changing environment. I think this winter seems to be an anomaly in recent years. This is probably the most winter-like winter I've experienced since moving to Maine 4 or 5 years ago. But like most winters seem, honestly, I've found them quite pathetic, which is really disappointing. Just a lot of freeze thaws and not a lot of snow just sticking around through winter. And that is because globally, ambient temperatures are on the rise. And New England, especially, is one of the most pronounced hot zones being affected by global temperature rise, which is very disappointing to see. And the consequence is many, and I can't get to all of those now, but like some consequences, relate to the thermal ecology of species and whether or not that they are physically able to contend with increases in temperature, in summertime, but also in wintertime. And for some, like the little brown bat, that could mean shifting where they spend their winters, if they're able to. And here, the yellow stars are where hibernaculum, or places where the little browns are already overwintering. And this blue area is like a prediction about where we would expect the upper limits of their overwintering range to be. And then this red stripe here is where we might expect that to go by 2080 if climate change things continue as we see them. And so for species like little browns, as long as the physical habitat is there, a place for them to overwinter, caves and whatnot, as long as those exist, they'll be okay. They'll be fine. They can kind of shift their range in response to changes in temperature. But for some species like moose, that ability to move might not be possible. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the moose, winter tick problem, but moose may well be a thing of the past in Maine just because winter ticks are now able to successfully overwinter. Before, winter ticks simply just could not survive winter in a place like Maine because it was sufficiently cold to make sure that all their progeny died before spring came. But that's no longer the case, and it's having pretty significant effects on the survivability of Maine moose populations. And unlike little brown bats, moose can't really just shift their range all too easily, especially because it is so dependent on the physical terrestrial landscape, which of course little browns are also dependent on that, but their mode of transportation makes their interaction with the environment, fundamentally different to the disadvantage of moose. And with that, just want to thank you all for attending. I am sorry for sending on such a sad note, but it means that there are a lot of unanswered questions about, well, what does it mean to overwinter, and how will animals change their strategies? Will the opossum mode of just keep foraging your way northward until you can just make it in a place be a viable strategy? Will some species just be able to get food through winter sufficiently enough that they don't necessarily have to engage in torpor, or will hibernation regimes change? These are all active questions that are being pursued by people in my field all over the world. And with that, I'll stop for questions. Thanks.
Yeah, Eric, that was excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, we have a few questions. I've got a few. But
Sure.
Are there any data on what percentage of moose, deer, and bear die off naturally, not hunting or otherwise human related, during the winter? And how does this change due to year temperature variations?
Yeah, that's great. And I'm sorry if I missed any questions. I did not see the comment thing while I was going along. That
No
might have been
worries.
more natural. But certainly that stuff does exist. Unfortunately, I'm not too familiar with it. I think folks in UMaine's wildlife department are probably much more familiar with the management side of things. So your, DNRs and state wildlife departments would definitely be tracking that kind of information. I think, I'm from Pennsylvania, and white-tailed deer are big, and so there's a lot of work that goes into studying the overwintering in white-tailed deer, and there are a lot. I can't say percentage-wise, unfortunately, but there are a lot that starve. Just, well, one, there's an overpopulation of deer, and well, probably most places east of the Mississippi, simply because there are really no natural predators except for black bears and coy wolf, coyotes, that kind of thing. So I think probably, and now I gotta look. I'm interested now, but I would say it's probably more pronounced now than certainly like US colony days, certainly because we've wiped out all natural predators and overwintering. Well, now like the big thing they're contending with is like one another in competition with other deer and other browsers to actually find food to make it. I'm going to stop there for fear of rambling.
And I have just one quick question, which is, so when you had the weasel and it was white during the winter, obviously on the snow, so evolutionary wise, it's better for the weasel to be white to hide in the snow rather than to being dark and absorb heat in the winter. Does that follow?
That's it would. It would also, but many things can be true. I think like the kind of the accepted wisdom here is that the pressure, like the evolutionary, like selective pressure here must be stronger on their ability to blend in with the environment than on an ability to like better, procure heat from the environment. So, and that's kind of like the general sentiment, because otherwise, why do they do this? And then you've got other mustelids that don't change fur coat at all, and it might just depend on who they're hunting. Marten, they change their fur coat in density and some coloration, but they're not turning white. Otters don't turn white, wolverines and so on. So I think this, with these guys, it must largely have to do with who they're hunting, and that is more important than whatever heat they would get from the sun that very rarely shines on them anyway in wintertime, probably.
Excellent. Well, Eric, thank you very much. We greatly appreciate your presentation, and we'll have that on YouTube shortly, and we'll be in touch going forward.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Take it easy.
Thank you for joining this Tuesday talk. For more information, please visit Merryspring at www.merryspring.org and also